I want to thank you all for coming and welcome you all to this panel entitled The Role of Political and Economic Ideas in Policymaking. I'm James Morrison here in political science, and I've organized this panel together with support from the Rowatton Center for International Affairs, the Department of Economics, the Department of Political Science, and Atwater Commons. So we have a number of sponsors and very appreciative for helping them to make this happen. So I'm here. I'll say a few things. We have a number of very, very distinguished panelists. Doug Irwin, over here on my far right, is our special guest. He's going to discuss U.S. trade policy, the role of ideas in U.S. trade policy, with some contrast to Great Britain. Murray Dry is here from political science. He'll discuss Hamilton, Madison, and Jefferson in Republican government and federalism. David Colander on my left from economics will serve as a discussant. And the billing promised Mark Williams, but I'm sorry to report that Mark had a health issue arise, and so he's not going to be able to be here. Just so you know, he was planning to talk about the role of ideas in shaping key aspects of U.S. Latin American relations. So we won't have that, unfortunately. Okay, so before I turn things to our panelists, I'll just say a few words here about the panel and offer some preliminary remarks of my own about where I think we stand in terms of understanding the role of ideas in policymaking. So first, a couple remarks about the panel. So the big question, of course, is why have this panel? What's the purpose of this panel? What was I after in trying to organize this? So I have two objectives. The first is purely traditionally academic, and that's to try to explore how political and economic ideas have shaped policy in the past. And so some of the most important things we look at in politics and economics, of course, are why specific policies, particularly important policies, are chosen. And so we can think of the Townsend revenue duty and its role in generating the considerable angst amongst the Americans and leading to the American Revolution. The Smoot-Hawley tariff and its role in exacerbating the Great Depression. Britain's return to gold in 1925 and then subsequent departure from gold. And China's accession to the WTO. So we can look across the world, across time, and see key policies. And in each of these cases, it seems that ideas played at least some role. And so as academics, I think it's very important to try to understand the extent of that role and the nature of that role in influencing these very significant policy decisions. So that's the first goal. It's academic, to try to understand what ideas do in shaping policy. The second goal, I think, is a little bit more practical and applied. So I recognize here at Middlebury College that a lot of you are very interested in ideas, but also very interested in going out into the world and actually doing things and making things happen, something I have not yet done myself, but maybe someday. Actually getting real jobs and working for the WTO or the IMF or the State Department and making things happen. And so keeping my audience in mind here, I wanted to organize this panel because I thought that it would be very useful to explore from a practical standpoint what role ideas might play in your lives as you become actual policymakers. So those are the two goals. That's why I organized the panel, and that's what I hope we'll be able to, the two goals we'll be able to advance with this panel. But before I go on, let me offer a couple of my own preliminary remarks about what I think, where I think we stand in terms of understanding some of the big questions about the role of ideas in policy. Okay, so for centuries, scholars have debated whether ideas matter, and if they do matter, in what ways they matter, what functions they serve in shaping policy. I think that, especially recently, there's come to be kind of broad agreement that ideas do matter. There's disagreement, of course, about the extent to which they matter, but I think everyone recognizes, even the most materialists of us, recognize that ideas do matter and are thus worth some consideration. I also think that there's a kind of growing understanding of what role ideas actually serve or play as they influence policy. And they kind of do two things, I think. We have ideas that are normative, which help to shape our values and our preferences, our standards of right and wrong. And these tell us what we ought to be trying to do in the world, what we ought to be doing in the world. And so we have normative ideas, and ideas seem very important. The stuff inside our head seem very important for determining our standards of right and wrong and our preferences. But then we also have positive ideas, which are not so much about what we ought to do, but about how we can do the things we want to do. So these, in this sense, ideas serve as strategies or roadmaps to try to accomplish our goals given institutional and environmental constraints. So I think that the kind of old debate of whether ideas matter and what they do in shaping policy, I think that there's growing consensus there. That's not to say that we can't still continue to make more progress there as an intellectual scholarly community, but I think we have a lot of progress. There are, though, a couple questions that I think have gone under-conceptualized for too long, and I think that they deserve more of our attention. And these questions are how we explain the development, the adoption, and the subsequent implementation of these policy-influencing ideas. So if we accept that ideas matter, I think it's really important to try to understand where these ideas come from, why some ideas get accepted and not others, and then once policymakers and actors in the world have these ideas, how they go about actually implementing these things to influence policy and actual political and economic outcomes. So, the first of those questions, how are these policy-changing ideas formed? Here, I see wide variation in our understanding. So in the course that a lot of us have been doing together, International Political Economy, we looked at the development of Adam Smith's ideas and John Maynard Keynes' ideas. And in both cases, that development seemed to be almost entirely theoretical. Smith carefully considered the mercantilists, didn't write about them very carefully, but carefully considered them, developed a criticism of their ideas, and then submitted this to policymakers. So the development was theoretical. Keynes developed his criticisms of the gold standard, returned to the mercantilists, saw inspiration there, and then submitted these to policymakers. Now, our special guest here, Doug Irwin, of course, has written about this question of where ideas come from, how they're developed. And he's actually found, in the case of Sir Robert Peel, the opposite tendency, that in fact Peel was already aware of the panoply of different theories of political economy in the 1840s, but that it was empirical engagement with actual experimentation with policy that led him to an intellectual revolution. So I think there's a real tension here about where ideas come from, how they're developed. Are these developed in a kind of deductive theoretical process, or are they developed via experimentation and empirical investigation? So that's the first question, development. And I think there's a lot we can say about that and a lot we can explore. The second one then is about adoption. So obviously, I think it's inadequate to say that policymakers adopt the ideas that serve their interests. That's inadequate not because it's somehow incorrect, but because it underspecifies results, right? There are lots of ideas, all of which proclaim to maximize policymakers' interests. The question is not whether they're looking for the best policy to maximize their interest, but how they pick which policy they think will maximize their interest. So how do policymakers go about and choose these things? We see a kind of conservative bias at a lot of key points in history where policymakers just keep using the same old policy solutions because they hesitate to pick something new. But at other points, we see veritable revolutions in policymakers' choice of strategies. Richard Nixon's abandonment of gold in 1971 is a great example. So the question there is, how do policymakers pick between the different policies and strategies they're going to adopt? Okay. Last question, then, is about implementation. So assuming we know where policies come from, these policy influencing ideas come from, assuming we have some sense of how policymakers choose them, how do we actually conceptualize and understand how these ideas get implemented? How much latitude should we allow policymakers to depart from the ideas that they are adopting? Certainly we don't want to allow them infinite latitude, because then policymakers could say that they're adopting one set of ideas but in fact adopt a very contrary set. But at the same time, I don't think we can hold policymakers quite to the standard of doing everything their theorists and scholars and intellectuals suggest. So when we try to understand what ideas policymakers are working with, what are the standards by which we evaluate their implementation? So those are some preliminary remarks. Those are the kinds of things that are on my mind. I think it's very important for us, of course, to understand this question of ideas and influencing policy, and I hope that I've piqued your interest a little bit in thinking about some of these additional, I think, under-conceptualized issues about where ideas come from, how they're chosen, and then how they're implemented. And I'll leave the rest here to my very esteemed, very esteemed colleagues, and see what they have to say about the answers to those questions and any other questions about policy. So we'll go first to our special guest, Doug Irwin. Doug Irwin is the Robert E. Maxwell Professor of Arts and Sciences in the Department of Economics at Dartmouth College. He has written and is continues to write, of course, about American trade policy from the colonial days to the present. I think it's safe to say that Professor Irwin is the leading scholar in the world on the history of U.S. trade policy. He's also one of the leading scholars on the history of economic thought and the influence of ideas on economic policy more generally. So it's safe to say that he's very welcome on this panel, and we're delighted to have him. So, Doug.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank James for the invitation and for that very nice introduction to the ideas we're going to be talking about. When we're interested in the role of ideas in economic policy making, it's a very rich area to consider, I think. There's so much history, so many interesting questions to be pursued. So when one wants to start out, we really have to have a framework in some way to sort of organize our thoughts about how we want to think about the role of ideas in policy making. And I think the best way to do that is to think about a triad of things that influence policy making. Sometimes I call them the three I's. The first one is interests, for economic interests. The second I is for institutions, meaning political institutions. And the third I is for ideas or ideology. And it's each of these three things that play a role in most major policy decisions, and I'll talk mainly about economic policy, of course. So what about the first issue there, economic interests? Well, John Stuart Mill, the great 19th century economist, philosopher, and polymath, said, "A good idea seldom triumphs unless someone's interest is bound up with it." We might think that's a cynical way of thinking about things, but I think history would prove him right. So, for example, think about banning the slave trade, which surely is the correct moral thing to have been done in the early 19th century or so. And it was debated, of course, in Congress and during the Constitutional Convention and at various points in U.S. and U.K. history. Well, it turns out if you look at the various states in the United States that were thinking about doing this around the time of the Constitution, some southern states were in fact willing to ban the importation of slaves. And the reason is they had an abundance and they wanted to keep up the price. So it wasn't out of any great moral concern for the fate of the slaves. They had a pecuniary interest in keeping the price of slaves at a very high level. If one looks at the British effort to eliminate the slave trade too, there were financial interests behind that. It wasn't just the moral force of religious and other workers in the UK. If one thinks about prohibition, an experiment in the United States to ban alcohol, it'd be interesting to take a survey of students and get their opinion on such a policy. But once again it wasn't just the Baptists, but it was the Baptists and the bootleggers. The bootleggers, those who were interested in squelching the public trade in alcohol so that they could have the market for themselves. They formed this sort of dual force behind prohibition at the time. There was some interest bound up in it. If we think about U.S. ethanol policy today, an economic policy, an energy policy that literally does not make sense, is bad on environmental grounds, bad on foreign policy grounds. Why do we have this? Well, you have to ask an Iowa corn farmer, and of course the road to the White House leads from Iowa to Washington. Why we have this? There's a pecuniary interest behind keeping the price of corn high. Certain farmers benefit from that, and unfortunately we have a president who's now from a state with a lot of corn farmers in it, so overturning that, one hopes he looks to the national interest and not to the Illinois state interest in thinking about that. But at any rate, when one looks at history and major policy changes, one can usually find, if one scratches beneath the surface, and sometimes you don't have to scratch that far, economic interests that have a stake in the policy change and have been pushing for it. Ambrose Bierce, a humorist in the United States, once said that politics is a strife of interests masquerading as a contest of principles. Cynical perhaps, but that's at least one way to approach this question. But of course, economic interests aren't enough because there's usually an economic interest on one side of the equation and another one on the other side. So the question is, who wins? How does that policy actually determine? That's where we need the second I, which is political institutions. That's where these economic interests do battle and try to work through the political system to determine what the policy outcome will be. And of course, there are many political systems that adjudicate these interests in different ways. In the United States, we have a constitutional system, which of course is designed to slow policy. I don't want to talk too much about the founding period, but I believe that, and this may be apocryphal, and I may get the names wrong, but I believe it was Thomas Jefferson who was upset at some point with the fact that we had this Senate that was slowing things down. And it was George Washington who pointed to him that asking, why do you pour your tea into your saucer before you put it into your cup? And Jefferson replied, to cool it down. And Washington said, that's exactly why we have the Senate, to cool the passions in the House and try to slow down legislation and have a more reasoned debate about the policy issues of the day. Other political systems, such as a parliamentary system, where you basically have the House of Commons, can move things very quickly. And there's not that check. There's not that veto point of another chamber to really slow things down. And of course, there are other autocracies or dictatorships where economic policy changes can be brought about very efficiently, very quickly. Not to say that's good, but there are those various interests have to work through different systems that work at various speeds and weigh certain interests over others. This is very important if we're considering, say, for example, India versus China in their quest to remove themselves from the horrible affliction of poverty that is pervasive in both countries. China can move much more quickly in certain directions because their Communist Party has a political dictatorship. India has a long-standing democracy which has slowed the pace of reform because it has to be mulled over and different economic interests have to be accommodated, something that a Communist Party doesn't necessarily have to do. Well, once one takes a look at the role of economic interests in policymaking and considers the political institutions through which these interests work their way out, what role is left for ideas? Is it really all just interest groups and that's it? Well, John Maynard Keynes had the famous quote, which I'm sure you've heard, but invariably comes up in discussions of economic ideas and policymaking when he wrote in the General Theory of Interest, Employment, and Money in Employment in 1936, the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economists. He also said in that book, it is ideas, not vested interests, which are dangerous for good or evil. So there must be a role in there for ideas. At some point, we think as academics we matter, our ideas matter in some way, but the question is, how do we know? How do we measure that? How can we assess that? How can we document it? Well, it is actually a very difficult thing to do, but I think we can do so in a very qualitative way. So the political scientist and historian Peter Hall has distinguished three levels of policy making. First-order policy changes, which are in which the overarching goals that policy is aiming toward change. Second-order and third-order policy changes, which are when the techniques used to attain certain goals are changed, or the precise setting of the policy instruments change. And what he suggests is that it's the first-order policy changes, where the direction of policy changes radically, where you get big, discontinuous changes in policy. Those are precisely the settings in which ideas matter the most. So to think about it this way, if the tax system were to change in a major way, from no income tax to an income tax, or today what we might have to consider from an income tax to an income tax plus a value-added tax, those are not adjusting rates, the marginal rates from 35% to 39% on the highest income brackets. Those are fundamental economic policy reforms. Those are the ones where ideas matter, not when we're adjusting the rates or fine-tuning the policy instruments. So when are we going to see big discontinuous policy changes? Well, to draw on another political scientist's work, Jeffrey Legro, he says we're going to get big discontinuous changes under three circumstances, when three conditions are fulfilled. First of all, when a given policy generates a consequence that deviates from what people expect. Two, when the consequences are that unexpected change are undesirable. And three, when a viable replacement alternative exists. So how do the role of ideas work out in those three things? Well, I'll just consider two cases very briefly, the repeal of the Corn Laws in Britain, and then, of course, talk more about U.S. trade policy in that regard. So when we think about why is it that the British in 1846 repealed protection for domestic agricultural producers, a huge shift in their economic policy. Now, certainly economic interests were important behind that. There were the manufacturers of cotton textiles that wanted to export more. There's certainly the economic interests opposed to that, the landowners that you see in Jane Austen movies, sitting around the mansion, not doing a day's work, it seems, but talking about who's going to come and visit today and what should we serve for dinner. How can they afford to support themselves in that mansion? They're the landowners that would resist this change. So what exactly happened? They had these two opposing interests. They were in sort of a stalemate. One might attribute this to the change in ideas of Sir Robert Peel, the Prime Minister at the time, who in 1846 decided to repeal the Corn Laws. Others have said we can't really point to any individual as being critical here. Nobel laureate economist George Stigler observed that Sir Robert Peel actually unfortunately died and being thrown from his horse in 1849. What if he had been thrown off his horse 10 years earlier? If he had died, would we still have had the Corn Laws today? Would they not have been repealed at some point, he said, trying to put down this idea that we need the great person in history to make policy changes? Sort of unlikely that that change would not have occurred. Well, think about Legro's ideas. One, the policy generates a consequence that deviates from what is expected. Well, there was the Irish famine, which is a very important event. The British needed to feed themselves. There was a viable replacement alternative. That is, you could open the country to the free importation of grain. That would solve the famine problem. And regardless of who was prime minister, perhaps, at that time they would have had a compelling interest in changing policy in a very dramatic way and going against the landlords of the day and shifting policy. And it just so happened that Sir Robert Peel was the person in power at that point, but any prime minister under those circumstances might have made a very similar decision. We can discuss that at the Q&A if you wish. How about the United States? Well, if we look to U.S. history, the United States has traditionally been a relatively isolationist country in terms of its trade policy. It maintained high protective tariffs from the Civil War right up to the 1920s and through the early 1930s. Well, what happened? How come we have these debates about free trade agreements today when U.S. tariffs are very low? What accounted for the shift in U.S. trade policy that really we can date from the early 1930s in terms of going from a protectionist closed nation to trade to being an open free trade country, no matter how people debate that proposition today? Well, once again, we had those three conditions that Legro pointed to. First of all, we had a policy that led to an outcome that deviated from what we expected. The outcome was undesirable. And third, there was a viable replacement idea. What was the unexpected outcome? Well, with the passage of the Smoot-Hawley tariff, as James mentioned, in June of 1930, it was followed by a collapse in U.S. trade and foreign retaliation against U.S. exports that put a further downward movement on U.S. trade. Now, it's a very interesting question that economists have asked. Is this a causal relationship? Did Smoot-Hawley lead to the decline in U.S. trade? And we can sort of separate out and parse those things out. But in fact, it doesn't matter whether the tariffs and the trade war that followed caused the decline in trade. They were linked inexorably in people's minds, that high tariffs led to retaliation and declining trade, and this is a factor, it was believed at the time, that led to the exacerbation of the Great Depression. The Great Depression not being a good thing, the outcome was not good. There was a viable replacement idea. That is, instead of raising tariffs, how about lowering tariffs and opening up to international trade, both potentially to combat the Depression and to lead to a different trade policy in the United States. Well, then we have to ask the question, what brought about those conditions were in place, but what actually implemented them? Were economists there? Now, it is true that economists, over 1,000 of them, had in 1930 signed a petition urging President Hoover to veto the Smoot-Hawley tariff. He declined that advice, which I think tells you something about the way in which economist advice is taken in Washington often. Utterly dismissed, it didn't matter. But that doesn't mean that economists were irrelevant to this whole process. First of all, economists kept alive this idea of the viable alternative, pointing out that if we didn't have these high protective tariffs, the economy wouldn't collapse, we wouldn't be inundated with foreign imports, we'd be able to export more as well, and the economy might actually do quite well. And second of all, there were many economists in government that believed in these ideas and were ready to implement them. And what was needed to implement them was a political entrepreneur, someone who stood above economic interests, someone who was part of the political institutional makeup, but had an embedded ideology, if you will, willing to move and try the idea of lower tariffs. And that person was Cordell Hull, someone you may not have heard of, but was America's longest-serving Secretary of State. from 1933 to 1944. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1945 for his work on the United Nations and for his work on trade policy. Coming from the South, he had a firmly embedded belief that lower tariffs would produce not only good economic outcomes, but good political outcomes, that lower tariffs and freer trade among nations would have an important political byproduct in soothing tensions that might lead to war. And he came to this conclusion as a result of World War I, which he believed had an economic basis to it. So regardless of whether he was right or wrong, although political scientists tend to think he was right in terms of looking at conflict across countries and their trade policies, he was very much in favor of moving towards lower tariffs. He was the one responsible for something called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, which was part of the New Deal, enacted 75 years ago this year, which delegated from the Congress to the President authority to change U.S. tariffs. That is a major revolution, that one institutional change, in just giving the President the power to change tariffs and taking it away from Congress, that took it out of the hands of a log-rolling body and gave it to a person, an institution that wanted to use that power for foreign policy reasons as well as economic reasons. What's interesting in looking at the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934 and contrasting with the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, there was no interest group participation in Congress in pushing for the RTAA. That is, it was not a battle of interest groups. It was a battle of ideas about what trade policy should be and who should control it. It was one that economists were very much engaged in, but it's not as though exporters and other industries were saying, we want this legislation. It's not as though many import-competing industries were voting against it or wanted Congress to turn it down. It was not viewed as that important at the time because it didn't herald an immediate change in trade policy. Ultimately, it did lead to the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which has morphed into the World Trade Organization, which we have today. So looking at the origins of what we have today, and there's huge status quo bias in all political systems, certainly the U.S. in terms of trade policy, we have to look to what happened during the New Deal and the 1930s. When we think about big discontinuous changes in trade policy, I don't think we're going to see one between President Bush and President Obama. The institutional framework is set. Unless we have those three conditions, at least in terms of trade policy, that we have a big unexpected change, it's undesirable, and there's a viable alternative, there's probably going to be no large change. For example, President Obama has already backed away from his pledge to renegotiate NAFTA, something he suggested during the campaign. Now that's sort of off the table. So even that modest promise to modify a controversial agreement is now off the table. So let me just conclude by noting that this notion of trying to figure out how ideas matter and what way they matter and what context they matter is almost endlessly fascinating, and it's one that we can ponder in terms of the financial crisis today. We have a huge change from what we had expected just a few years ago in terms of the outlook for the economy. It's an undesirable change. The question is there a viable alternative? And what is that alternative, and who's going to shape that alternative? Thank you.
So now we'll have Murray Dry from Political Science.
This panel consists of different participants on ostensibly the same topic. I remember when I was asked to participate, I wasn't sure why I was asked, and because my remarks will be somewhat different from the remarks of our guest, I want to provide a bridge to try to show that there is some connection. Professor Morrison started with the proposition that academics generally agree that ideas matter, and the focus is on development, adoption, and implementation. And if I understood him correctly, Professor Irwin followed up on that and discussed those three elements of the second topic. I am going to speak about the first question, and I'm going to at least acknowledge the force of an authority that claims that ideas don't fundamentally matter because they're not, because what's fundamental is interests. One phrase that describes this comes from Karl Marx. Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. The most prominent student of the American Constitution, roughly 100 years ago, was Charles Beard. And he wrote a book called The Economic Interpretation of the American Constitution. In the body of my remarks, which are addressed to this question, can ideas matter, I want to focus on two related topics. One is Charles Beard's economic interpretation of the Constitution, and the other is James Madison. And the fact that this man was the father of the Constitution, which introduced a novel view of Republican government. And yet, when his collaborator in the writing of the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton, proposed a national bank in 1789, Madison joined Jefferson in opposing the bank. And that surely shocked Hamilton, and scholars have been studying that question of the Madisonian shift, yes or no, ever since. That's a brief introduction, and now I'll go to my prepared text. I understand the question of this symposium to be whether ideas or thought can guide policy or political action generally, or whether forces or interests do. Political science as a discipline comprehends two distinct approaches to thought and its relation to action. According to the tradition of political philosophy, thought can guide action. According to the more recent tradition of social science, following the model of natural science, the search is for causal relationships, and that means looking for forces or factors that determine action, regardless of human beings, what human beings as political actors may say. A phrase to describe this is, watch their feet, not their mouths. A more precise title than the one I offered weeks ago on this presentation would be On the Place of Thought in the American Founding, an examination of the framing and ratification of the American Constitution and the subsequent debate over the national bank. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson figure in this story because the first two were the main authors of the Federalist Papers on the one hand, and yet when Secretary of the Treasury Hamilton proposed a national bank and the full funding of the national debt, Madison joined Jefferson in expressing his opposition to it. And Jefferson had fundamentally supported the Constitution with some qualifications. And Charles Beard also plays a role in this account because of his economic interpretation of the American Constitution. I'll say a little bit about Madison and then turn to Charles Beard. Madison, the father of the Constitution, as he's called, and author of Federalist 10 in particular, became a strict constructionist, which originally meant he interpreted the scope of the powers of Congress under Article 1, Section 8 narrowly, with Jefferson in 1790 when the national bank was proposed. And this came as a surprise to Hamilton, and as I said before, scholars are still debating whether this constituted a fundamental shift. The reason this is a puzzlement is that in Federalist 10, Madison turned the traditional view that Republican government could only maintain its characteristically mild, its mild character over a small territory and homogeneous population. He turned this position on its head, starting from the proposition that the protection of the diverse faculties of men, from which gives rise to the rights of property, is the first object of government. The protection of the diverse faculties of men is the first object of government. And assuming the strength of the majority principle in American government, Madison argued that the operation of the larger and more diverse sphere of government, meaning the national government as opposed to the states, would produce better representatives and would mute the effect of faction by making it more difficult for one group to have its way without compromising with others. This is the case for the Constitution. With Hamilton's bank proposal, however, Madison joined Jefferson in expressing more concern about an inappropriate link between moneyed interests and the national government, to the detriment of the state governments, in contrast to his earlier concern about state-based majorities passing laws that denied property rights to individuals. One cannot help wondering about the possible influence of Jefferson on Madison at this point. They were close political allies, and sometimes Madison moderated Jefferson's views, while at other times he followed them, as in the case of the Bill of Rights. In addition, while Jefferson expressed his preference for farmers as the class most trustworthy because independent in the provision of the necessities of life in 1783, Madison did not express such a view in writing, as far as I know, until 1792, but he did at that time. So did the agricultural economy of Virginia finally determine both Jefferson's and Madison's views on Republican government, and thus their opposition to Hamilton's bank and his funding schemes? I do not think the answer is as simple as that, although I'm not going to try to elaborate on the reason for it with reference to Hamilton and Madison. Rather, to illustrate my point that I don't think it's as simple as that, I want to finish with some remarks about the debate over the federal Constitution. And I want to introduce the views of Charles Beard, whose economic interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, first published in 1913. It's nice when books stay in print. I purchased this as a graduate student in 1962, and I still have it. That's a nice thing about having a large office with plenty of bookshelf space. It was the first scholarly study of the Federalists to emphasize the importance of Federalist 10. That came as a shock to me when I learned that. After quoting Madison to the effect that the regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation, and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of government, Beard wrote, "Here we have a mastery statement of the theory of economic determinism in politics." Beard's footnote here is not to Marx, but to a Professor Seligman, he doesn't give the first name, whose explanation is clearly Marxist. That is, I'm paraphrasing, as the existence of man depends on his ability to sustain himself, quote, the similar relations of production and consumption are to the community. To economic causes, therefore, must be traced those transformations in the structure of society which themselves condition the relations of social classes and the various manifestations of social life. Beard distinguishes between real property, which means landed, and personal property, which means money that's loaned, state and continental securities, stocks of goods, manufacturing plants, shipping, etc. And he notes that this second kind, which he calls personalty, I'm not sure whether that word is in common usage anymore, but this non-land-based property, quote, is usually more active and is centralized in the towns and can draw together for defense or aggression with greater facility. Since a stronger federal government than the government existing under the Articles of Confederation, the then federal Constitution, was very likely to enhance the value of securities and to enhance in general the prospects for owners of personal property, Beard proceeds to examine the Federal Convention and the state ratifying conventions with a view towards correlating the kind and amount of property an individual owned with his vote for or against the Constitution. Beard does find some correlation between supporters of the Constitution and owners of personalty, and opponents of the Constitution and supporters of landed classes known as the yeomanry. But what can one make of this? Here are some reasons why I don't think the evidence supports his thesis. First, Jefferson from the start supported farming over manufacturing, but he also supported the Constitution, albeit he wanted a Bill of Rights, which he got, and he was eventually reconciled to the re-eligibility of the president. Second, Madison, who expressed similar views about agriculture to Jefferson in 1792, was the most significant framer in Philadelphia in 1787, and he led the successful fight for ratification in Virginia against Patrick Henry. Third, Alexander Hamilton, a forceful advocate of energetic government in the Federal Convention and in the Federalist, as well as in the New York Ratification Convention, was not an owner of substantial amounts of debt, that is, of discounted paper, of bonds, we would say, and Beard acknowledges this. He goes out of his way to acknowledge that Hamilton didn't propose what he did in order to personally make money. And Hamilton was the architect of the National Bank, the funding of federal debt at par and the funding of all state debt. He also wrote a report on manufacturers, which advocated what might be called the first governmental stimulus package. I conclude that Beard was right to highlight Federalist 10, but that his interpretation of it was wrong. The importance of property for individuals, and hence the importance of its protection by government, is an idea that has been debated throughout the history of political philosophy. We can and do assess the status of property claims in relation to what we expect of government, and we may well conclude that certain policies are correct, such as Madison's arguing against a Southern sectional veto on tariffs, even if they do not accord with our, his, the South's immediate interests. Beard was pointing to Madison's agreement with Locke, not his anticipation of Marx. Thank you.
This is great so far. So now David Colander will offer some remarks as discussant.
I agree with everything they said. Although I'm supposed to say something, so I'll try and say something. They both talked about deeper ideas, probably because they're deep people. I'm a very superficial person, and so I'm going to talk about superficial issues. Really, in some ways, my experience with ideas and trying to get ideas through. And in thinking of that, I thought of the movie The Graduate. I don't know how many of you have seen The Graduate. Any of you have?
The old ones.
A few people have. The older people have, but the younger one. In it, Dustin Hoffman, sort of plays a young person who gets seduced by this older woman who's very beautiful. I think it's Anne Margaret, right?
Anne Bancroft.
Anne Bancroft, yes. And, he goes up to her husband and sort of talking about what, is the future. And the man says, plastics. So my contribution to this seminar is going to be cocktail parties. Because in many ways, the way in which ideas matter is not so much here in terms of the books that are written, in terms of the arguments that people make within academics. It's what goes on at the set of cocktail parties. What is an offhanded discussion, offhanded comment that sort of affects somebody and they think, that's there, and then you get it going there. So there's this randomness within the process. And I say that not from having studied the issue in great detail. As I said, I'm a superficial person. But from my own experience. When I was sort of a youngster, back in those long, long days, I thought I could affect something. And so I went down to Washington to work at Brookings Institution there. And my future wife, future first wife, I should say, also went down. She was a legislative assistant. And we were seen as two of the up-and-coming stars sort of coming down there to really affect, Washington. And she was selected as a Rhodes Scholar, so we had all the right credentials. So we got invited to all the right set of cocktail parties. Whereupon, I quickly learned that I had no stomach for policy whatsoever. Because you have to say the right things to the right people and be very worried about saying it, and how you look is important. That's when I decided to become a total academic and sort of stay out of ideas. But really, when I saw here, sort of that chance to get that idea just to be mentioned to the person, to get him to think of it. What lobbyists do, what other people do, is really trying just to find a little space where you can affect somebody, and that can play a big role in what ultimately shows up as the policy that actually works on. So you have this sense in terms of the actual policy ideas are decided at cocktail parties. And unless you're good at cocktail parties, You probably cannot play that game. I am not good at cocktail parties. So I cannot make small talk. I look at things and say what I think. Not wise to do that, which my ex-wife told me was not wise, and we went our separate ways. She moving, ahead in, government and other things, and me moving off to academia, where you're encouraged to say whatever you want, because it doesn't matter. And the ideas that economists and various people put forward, really, some students can think about it, but, on the broader sense, you're allowed to say things even if you're being tape recorded, because very few people are going to watch the video in any case, at least I hope. So that's, sort of my overall sense. I kept sort of being involved in policy to some degree, and when Mondale ran, I had sort of kept that up, and they invited me up to talk to Mondale, and sort of specify, and he said, what, sort of actually should we be running as our policy? And I said, the thing you want to do is to, say you're going to balance the budget and increase taxes. If you remember, Mondale actually, followed that strategy. Not just because I said it, because a number of us said it, and got annihilated. After that, anybody who said, that as a policy, because the nation needed it, didn't have a chance. And the Republican Party fully changed its policy and said they've never seen a tax that they like, and all taxes should be going down. Democrats said, we can't. If Republicans don't raise taxes, we can't. And we got into the position that we are, that ultimately is going to, sort of lead the economy into a major, major problem, worse than what we're experiencing now, if we don't deal with that. So that idea is held by economists overall, but the chance of it actually affecting policy is almost nil. But there's another realm of ideas that I think, sort of operates, and that's what I call grand ideas. The ones that are not meant to affect policy, but are meant to somehow affect students' thinking a little bit, and they say, maybe it's worthwhile looking at something in a slightly different way. Milton Friedman followed that strategy very much, and if you look at his early work, when he was a graduate student, he was considered this weird, wild guy, so who didn't go along with any of the ideas. And he kept putting far-out ideas, such as vouchers to pay for education. When they were first put out, they were seen as just absolutely crazy. And there's a variety of other ones, that the ideas are out there and they're just thrown out as seeds. You throw out 100, 200 seeds, maybe one of them might grow, and you're never quite sure what. But it's through, the educational process where you're presented with as many different ideas as possible. When you're not thinking, can this idea be implemented? When you're thinking, does this idea in some sense make a broader sense? So when you're thinking in that way, that's the way I think, so I decided I could affect ideas and go on there. One other time, within that, I started working on wild ideas. And so one of my ideas, this was during the inflationary times in the 70s, was to create property rights and prices. Okay, so that any firm that wanted to raise its price had to pay another firm to lower its price by an offsetting amount. So you couldn't have any inflation, which meant you could expand considerably, sort of the economy. And so I developed that with Abel Lerner, who was known for pushing out wild ideas. And, sort of again, sort of started talking. And Al Kahn, who was the inflation czar at the time, so Alfred Kahn, there, said, I've been reading some of your stuff. Why don't you come in and sort of talk to me? So I stopped in the White House, got to go into the, sort of that area and sort of said, here, sort of explain the idea to him. And what he said to me was, sort of essentially, I did not talk to you. do you realize I just got, sort of annihilated by the press for saying something about bananas? He had said something about the bananas and, had gotten in trouble for the press. If I ever, he said, the idea you're putting out is a more substantial change than the creation of the Federal Reserve. And I said, yeah. He said, that's not part of the discussion. One can't talk about that. It's only these marginal, very small changes that one can talk about. The problem is, marginal, very small changes have marginal, very small results. And ultimately, it's the big changes that matter. So what I take as Keynes's, sort of sense, is not ideas in the micro sense of operating there, but ideas in the macro sense. How do you put together an economy? How do you put together a political system that sort of meets those things? Those are the ideas that will not directly affect policy, but will ultimately frame the way in which people who will affect policy affect it. And so that would be, sort of my contribution. Thanks.
So that was great. Thank you very much, David and Murray and Doug. So a number of very, very different perspectives there about the role that ideas play, the extent of their influence, and we have a good 30 minutes or so for questions. So fire away. Yes, Will?
With your example of Peel and the Corn Laws, couldn't we still see that as a case where interest was dictating rather than ideas? I mean, there was this idea behind, you remove the tariff and everything will change, but this situation and these three preconditions that you outlined for all these sorts of changes seem to indicate that there's something bad, there's going to be interest in changing it, and that interest will then dictate the change, rather than in the case of, say, with the National Bank, where there wasn't necessarily this adverse crisis or anything that required it, and thus there could be this idea that by itself was what was guiding policy. So how do we reconcile ideas with interest in kind of these cases of crisis or where something's going wrong?
So I guess in some sense, it depends on the time horizon that you're considering. So one question is, what was the role of ideas in eventually bringing Britain to become a free trading country? And another question would be, why did Britain make that switch in 1846 as opposed to 1836 or 1856 or some other period? And I think sort of when I was talking about the crisis idea, that explains the timing of changes. But then the broader question is, well, what's framing the alternatives when you do hit a crisis point? And obviously interests matter because we saw them battling in the political arena, but given that there was a status quo bias and given that at any given point in time before that time, they were offsetting each other, or there was sort of it was sort of a draw politically. How can we say that interests were changed from 1842 to 1846 to bring about the change? So I guess I sort of bring everything together. You need the economic interests. Well, the economic interests are out there battling, but then to explain timing, you maybe need something else, unless there's some change in the political power of the interest that changes in one particular time. So it wasn't that manufacturing interests were stronger in 1846 than they were in 1842 or 1838, but there was this other thing going on that allowed the policy change to take place. So I think that's why it's sort of a nuanced, perhaps a waffling answer, but I think it's one that distinguishes between the timing of a policy change and sort of the underlying factors that are going on to dictate what will happen in the medium to longer term.
That was a really interesting panel, and I have a number of questions, but I think I'll just throw a big one out for our economists. And I'll start where you ended up with the financial crisis and this big unexpected change, the undesirable effect, and the big question is, do we have viable alternatives? I want to throw that back to the economists. Do we? And to what extent is Marx in 2009 a viable alternative? Or has that frame or idea, in your view, been, in a sense, dashed on the shores of material experience?
Well, I don't think Marx provides any guidance, so I would sort of rule that out as an alternative, but that's a great question. And here's, I think, where ideas have mattered, and in particular, our understanding of history. And I'll go back to Milton Friedman that Professor Colander referred to. He wrote a book in 1963 called The Monetary History of the United States, which proposed, then was a relatively novel view, although you can always find earlier proponents of it, a view of why we experienced the Great Depression in the 1930s. And he laid the blame largely on the monetary authority at the time, the Federal Reserve. So that's just an academic work. It was a piece of history. You can debate how strongly they made their case or what have you. But here's where it's influenced things. And if you look at the press, there are a tremendous number of analogies being drawn between our current crisis and the Great Depression. Here's one fundamental reason why we will probably not have a depression nearly as great as what we experienced in the 1930s, is that we have learned a lesson from the past, and the ideas matter. So when we look at what happened in the 1930s, the response of policymakers, as the unemployment rate is going up, as industrial production is tanking, could we use monetary policy to get ourselves out of this? Well, we could not, because we were on a gold standard, and there was a great reluctance of presidential candidates in the 1932 election to say we're going to have an inflationary binge or what have you. They didn't really offer many changes. Could we use fiscal policy as a way to get us out of the Depression? Well, once again, President Roosevelt campaigned in 1932 on a balanced budget platform, saying that Hoover had spent too much and hadn't economized. So here we had handicapped ourselves with two potential policy instruments that were sort of taking off the table as a way to combat this, and lo and behold, we reached a nadir in 1933 with an unemployment rate of 25%. So what has been the response today? Ben Bernanke, an economist, chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, a student of monetary history, who has devoted much of his professional career to understanding and expanding on the work largely of Friedman on the monetary aspects of the Great Depression, and he's extended a lot of that work. As soon as this began to hit, and he was surprised to it, and he had admitted it, we did exactly the opposite of what we did in the early 1930s. Instead of pursuing a continuously contractionary monetary policy, we have a massively expansionary monetary policy. We'll see how it works and when this feeds through to the system. But the policy response is exactly the opposite of the 1930s. And clearly, obviously, fiscal policy as well, which really wasn't tried in the 1930s, is now being tried in an unprecedented peacetime situation, where this year we're expected, or next year we'll have a fiscal deficit of 11% of GDP. Absolutely unprecedented. So exactly the opposite response in terms of monetary policy, fiscal policy. There are obviously debates among economists about that, but I think the lesson of history was learned. And it wasn't learned as an obvious lesson, because in 1955, 20 years after the Depression, there was still a debate about the role of monetary policy. And so I think it's with time and analysis that we have learned something, and we're seeing them implemented. And certainly we are, Ben Bernanke and Christina Romer, who's the chairwoman of the Council of Economic Advisors, is a student of the Great Depression. So the ideas that they've taken from that experience, the things that they've learned in terms of their scholastic studies and academia, is very much influencing the policy approach we see today.
Yeah. Can I just clarify what I meant, because I think
I
didn't make myself clear. I mean, you're describing a policy response that the United States can take, but that is not an option that's available to other countries in the world, because the dollar is a reserve currency, and I think that gives us a range of policy alternatives and levers that other less powerful countries, economically speaking, might not have. And I was really interested in whether you think people like Chavez, will we really see a return to more central planning around the world? Or was this triumph for the market that everybody was trumpeting, in the past decade, something that's more permanent? In other words, will we be rereading Marx? I'm really interested in whether you think that's an idea frame that's exhausted itself. And maybe this is just a crazy academic idea, but I'm curious what you think.
I'll just speak very quickly because I want to hear the other responses or ideas on this. But it was very easy for Hugo Chavez to advocate nationalization and redistribution and state ownership when oil was $150 a barrel. We'll see whether we can do it at $30 to $40 a barrel. We look to you.
You're the other economist on the panel.
Sure.
What's the next idea if helicopter money doesn't work?
Again, I see it a little bit differently than Professor Irwin. Sort of the story that he tells, and I think most economists tell, is one of here. In the 1930s, the economists got it wrong, so that's what Friedman said. They didn't understand it. They weren't there. And, we've learned since then, and we're doing a better job. I don't think we ever learn, because I don't think, it's quite clear that there's any real answer, because politics pull one in different ways. So my read of what happens in the 30s had to do with politics limited what they could do as much as ideas. Very much. They knew at the time if we expanded spending, so we could do that, and it would improve the economy. But we had made agreements internationally and where you were going to go. There were all kinds of fights and the gold standard and where you were there. So how much were we going to committed to that? I see it pretty much, you're driving down from Breadloaf or from the skee bowl, okay? Or coming over 125, which you probably did on the way from Dartmouth. And your brakes give out. So then you're coming down around Ripton. Now you're coming into a curve and you have to make a decision. Do you step on the brakes whereupon you get it to pull through the curve? Or do you, try and, should I crash here? And essentially, one has to make a decision, where am I going to crash? Our reaction to the latest problem has been put on the gas. Step on the gas enormously. What that doesn't take into account is we have about 5 or 6 more curves to hit. One of those has to do with the international situation, with the dollar being the reserve currency and everyone trying to turn in the dollar. Now, I don't think that'll happen because it's not in their interest for that to happen, so they'll try for it not. But at some point, that is going to come to bear. We've just put out $2 trillion worth of, additional, money for the Fed. We're running deficits of about $1.5, $1.4 trillion a year for we don't know how long. At some point, people are going to say, those government bonds that are the safest thing in the world, are they all that safe? Now, what that means, for the U.S., are we another banana republic? There's been a big set of things on the web that are sort of coming out and saying, is the U.S. going to become a banana republic? That's what the earlier economists said we can never allow to happen. How we're going to stop that from happening in a political sense is what I'm not sure about. So the fact is, yes, I probably would have supported all the things that we did, because I'm old enough and maybe we can keep going around these corners and I'll be dead by the time. But you guys are very much going to be around and have to deal with that. So there's some very long-run problems that they haven't even started to deal with yet. And so is Marx dead? As long as we can keep pulling the car around the corner, yes. If we actually lose it one time, and bonds, and the basis problem is, of course, what happens when people no longer want to hold government bonds, so the interest rate on U.S. government bonds goes up, which means the deficit goes up much more because we have all those bonds. It becomes, itself a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we've never dealt with the failure of a country as major as the U.S. in the world. And so at that point, when the world has crashed, then perhaps, Marxism might come back into play. But all kinds of things will be in play at that point.
I have a response, which is a little bit. So I'm less optimistic than Professor Irwin. Maybe not as pessimistic as Professor Colander.
No one's as pessimistic as me.
I can't afford to be. But So I'm less optimistic because I'm not sure that I think, Allison, that the response to your question is I don't think that we have a new set of ideas to handle this new crisis. And so in the 1890s, there was the Panic of 1893. There were economic crises, and the person, the foremost critic of government monetary policy was William Jennings Bryan, and he just didn't command public attention the way subsequent critics did. And so they just went back and they did their own thing, right? And things eventually pulled through. The difference with the 1930s and then the 1970s was that you had two key intellectuals in the persons of John Maynard Keynes and Milton Friedman that were able to make credible arguments that for decades they had been predicting the very crises that were surrounding them. And so in the 1930s, in 1931, Keynes said to Ramsay MacDonald, I told Winston Churchill in 1925 not to go back to gold. I told him that. I told the entire economic community, and nobody listened, and we had 10, 12, 15% deflation, followed by 15% unemployment, followed by strikes and damn near revolution in Britain. And nobody listened. And then eventually we just did the British thing, and we pulled through, and that was fine. But now, you can't afford to not listen this time. I'm telling you, again, expand the money supply, go off gold. And he had as a result, a very, very credible argument that people ought to actually try his revolutionary policy because when they didn't last time, things went exactly the way they went. And of course, as I tell my students, nobody wanted to be Woodrow Wilson, play the part of Woodrow Wilson in the economic consequences of the peace. So they were part of Winston Churchill in the economic consequences of Mr. Churchill. In the 1970s, when the dollar was incredibly weak, Milton Friedman was able to say, I've been telling everybody since 1953 to get rid of the fixed exchange rate regime. I've been telling everybody this. I explained that this was the problem in the 1930s. I gave theoretical reasons in 1953, the case for flexible exchange rates, for why we should get rid of the fixed exchange rate. And this is the solution. And so then on the Council of Economic Advisors, he yelled in Nixon's ear. Nixon said, hey, this is great. Actually works with my interest. It makes sense. This guy is respected, and he has been proven right historically. The trouble I see now is there isn't a Friedman or a Keynes of which I'm aware who is able to say, I predicted the crisis in the 90s. I predicted the crisis today. And the solution I have, which is radical and different, is the right one. So I'm not, maybe there's a Marxist somewhere that's saying this, but we might. I mean, Paul Krugman might be the Friedman or the Keynes of today, but we might be in the 1890s. We might just have to ride this out with the old policies because I'm not aware of any truly revolutionary policy. I don't know. So I'm curious. Am I missing? I'm not an economist. Am I missing?
I don't know of any. I mean, even when I look at someone like Nouriel Roubini or some people who sort of predicted this or had inklings that things were going to go sour, it's not as though they have a plan that they've sort of unveiled and say, this is what we have to do. Even Krugman doesn't have that. He's a great critic, but I'm not sure he has, he wants to nationalize the banks. Beyond that, I'm not sure what else he would do. He certainly supports, he thinks the fiscal stimulus is not big enough, but that's just fine-tuning, how far should you go. But it's not that as though he has alternatives. Now, there may be them out there, and we'll find them when we do the autopsy, but nothing out there that I can see.
Yes.
I just read a Joe column about the role of academics in policymaking, and it seems like Professor Colander kind of touched on academics having a distaste for politics and cocktail parties, and I was curious if
we like cocktail parties.
Sorry. And I was curious if this is kind of, there's an academic distaste for going into government and policymaking because of this idea of revolutionary big ideas and kind of against the tradition of nuance and detail.
The problem for me is that ideas, as they work their way through Congress, do not work their way through Congress or the real world on the basis of the arguments in terms of the idea. They make it through context. They make it through worrying about a whole variety of things that are really quite tangential to the idea. And so, I think that's absolutely necessary, and people who can do that are very good. It's just I have no skill in that whatsoever and no interest in it. So it's just a different skill. Sort of people who can sort of husband an idea through, sort of to actually move it there, versus people who throw out seeds for all kinds of ideas and then talk about it in free flow, sort of going there. And some of those may influence somebody at some time, but I think there are two different worlds out there. And so there are some academics who very much work within Congress and government. My own feeling is if you're working within Congress and government, you can't have the openness about the ideas to really talk about, sort of them in a way. So in other words, if somebody who's husbanding ideas should suddenly say to Professor Sanger, yeah, Marx had some good ideas, that would be the kiss of death. You are not allowed to say that, even though Marx had some wonderful set of ideas. As did, sort of Austrian economist Hayek. But if you say that, what you have to do is to take a middle-of-the-road approach, which rounds off all the hard edges and makes everything sound like it's going to be successful and nice. Whereas in the other way, you sharpen all the edges so you can poke other people with them. And sort of the way in which ideas interact are a bunch of academics poking other people.
Yeah, a couple of brief comments, but also one, I guess, suggestion perhaps. With regard to Professor Dry's paper, I think the Seligman you were citing there is not a Marxist. That's E.R.A. Seligman, I'm pretty sure, a colleague at Columbia of Charles Beard. And he wrote a three-part article in Political Science Quarterly called Materialist Theory of History. And he was a German-trained economist, so he was kind of channeling the German historical school, but it was definitely not a Marxist story. With regard to Professor Morrison, I really think that it wasn't Keynes talking to Ramsay MacDonald that took Britain off gold in 31. I mean, they had adverse speculation, and they were just running out. I think with Eichengreen's book kind of speaks to this, where the British Central Bank never really had that much gold. They were sort of the center of the gold standard, but they were really always a smoke and mirrors kind of shop. I mean, they didn't have a lot of gold there, and they couldn't handle it. And I think Nixon also, we had a lot more gold. But again, it wasn't Milton Friedman. I mean, the French were dumping a lot of gold on the market, and they could see where that trend line was running. So I think they were just out of it. So I guess I come back to a more Beardian view in the sense of both those gold standard episodes. But with regard to the banks, I guess people seem to be saying there's not too many suggestions out there. I'm more sympathetic to Simon Johnson's story in this month's Atlantic Monthly and so on, where this really is just a more run-of-the-mill kind of banking crisis. I think Americans think it's extraordinary because it happened to us, but it's kind of a standard kind of thing where the banks simply suborn or capture the political process about 20 years ago in our case. They wrote a lot of rules that really had no justification in responsible ideas, but again, you can pay people. Plato talks about this. Is it better to be wise or better to be wealthy? And he says, well, it's better to be wealthy. You can buy wise people. And in this case, they simply got people like Larry Summers and other people who really, if you slap them twice and put them in a private room, he knows better. And they did things like repeal Glass-Steagall, the Commodity Futures, the Modernization Act, things like that that really should never have occurred in a responsible society. And as a result, they also suborned the regulation process where they got all kinds of accounting rule changes and other sort of things that created essentially a banking crisis. And what we need to do is either get the political will, which in many third world countries is impossible, which is what the IMF provides in these situations, where they provide an outside political will, and unfortunately that's the hard part right now, to take over these banks. And it's not nationalization, that's kind of a Republican word meant to scare us, but these are standard run-of-the-mill bank workouts. And the United States has done, 500 of these since about 1981. We're good at it. We have a comparative advantage, I'd say. We take over these banks. We break them up, so too big to fail now becomes too big to exist, and put back in the safeguards and the kind of redundancies that we used to have in case of problems, and go back to business as usual within a couple of years. Unfortunately, the political time to do that is now, because that will get harder as the years go by, and that's my biggest worry. So sorry if I took too long.
I thank you for, I'll check the Seligman, but if he's a colleague of Beard's and you think he's not a Marxist, maybe you think Beard isn't either. And
I don't think he is either.
Yeah, okay.
He's aggressive, however. The
Yeah.
We're very German trained.
Yeah, okay.
Kind of
But-
Schmoller, Wagner.
Yeah,
But it wasn't a Marxist.
yeah,
It was
see,
supposed to be anti-Marxist.
yeah, I think he squints very clearly towards Marx. He's the one that quotes Madison and says this is economic determinism. And then he's looking for this causal relationship between the kind of property you own and how you vote. And he's honest enough to say it doesn't apply to Hamilton. Well, Hamilton's a pretty important person. And his description of political science contains the word abstract in front of it. So my quarrel with him is not that property doesn't matter, but that we can think seriously about the importance of property and just how we want to place it within government. Aristotle argued for limits. It's not only Marx who said there should be some limits. But it seems to me that it's possible for people like Hamilton, Madison, and Jefferson to disagree about whether it's a good idea to support manufacturing or not, okay? So it's not a matter that it's thought versus interest, but is it really a matter, is the reductionism that amounts to saying, tell me how this person earns his or her living, or what's the position with respect to mode of production and exchange, and that tells me everything. Now, and in that connection, David Colander is a source of information for me. I draw on him. We are across the hall.
That's always the beginning of an attack.
Yeah, he's got it. It's a very civil and mild, to the extent to which I heard in any of his remarks, and you tell me whether you heard it, a certain expression of academic contempt for politics, because it's not just based on ideas. I'd like to make the short defense of politics that says it isn't study. Politics is not the same as the study of politics, especially if you're talking about democratic politics. And we're not all suited to that. It involves taking public sentiment, popular sentiment seriously and trying to direct it. Lincoln was the master, and he focused on a single issue because he thought eventually if he won on that single issue, he would change the character of the country. Oppose the extension of slavery. All right? So, I take it the trick for someone who wants to apply thinking to politics is you're not going to have the same time to do a seminar and read Plato, as Kissinger said, you're going to be working off your intellectual capital, and then you have to focus on what's important here and now, and then you also have to focus on what's possible, so you don't make proposals that are outlandish because they will not gather enough consent, and if the person that you advise on them makes that proposal, he or she somehow loses any credibility. So it's a different relationship to thought. If you want to be active in a democratic politics, you have to take your bearings by where public sentiment is and try in some way to nudge it in the right direction. It requires a certain amount of patience. That's true. It isn't the same as an academic life. But it can be, I think, very much informed by some appreciation of thought.
I don't think we disagree.
Okay.
I hope I made it clear that I regarded, sort of the one, just my particular comparative advantage, or what I felt. The other, it wasn't that I didn't respect it, or see it as something. It was just, here's how it had to be done. The problem of that, and you can see it, Obama I have enormous respect for. He seems to be, sort of the leader we've been looking for from all sides and everything else. But, what he's forced to do in terms of the statements he makes, you can imagine, you can put oneself in his mind. Sort of saying, here, I can't really say this, I have to go there, sort of carrying it out to 4 or 5 levels of strategy. And after you've done that for 2 or 3 years, there's a learning or getting stuck in that rut by doing. And once you've done that for some time, you become part of the process. And so for me, I think where we may disagree is, yes, I think academics have to, at some point, stay back from that so that they can, sort of take broader perspective than what you're forced into by being very much involved in politics. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have some people. I think we have way too many academics teaching, that we should have people who are involved in politics teaching and coming in. But they should be seen as different skills, as different types of activities, and we don't see them as that. So I'd see the academics are also trying to take the pulse of, sort of the population. It isn't that they're trying to push their particular views. They can try and say, here, given society's views, what might actually work in some sense if we could get people, talking about it and thinking about it. So I don't think it's here their views necessarily. It's what would work for society. And I don't think that distinction is made enough in academia.
Should we call it time?
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the panelists.